Welcome to another program from the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum in Arlington Center. I'm James P. McGough, former chairman of the Board of Trustees of the museum and your host for this presentation. During the early stages of the beginning of the museum in 2001 and 2002, we were contacted by and began to search for individuals who lived in Arlington and had memories and recollections of their meeting with Cyrus and/or Vittoria, and what the times were like in the 1920s and 30s in Arlington, especially Arlington Heights. As we began collecting these remembrances, it became fascinating to see what this sculptor really was like. Unfortunately, I became ill and could not continue the project. When I was able to resume the search, we were celebrating the 10th anniversary of the opening of the museum and having lectures. Then came along the celebrations of the 150th anniversary of Dallin's birth, and then came the pandemic. By then, most of the individuals who we needed to interview had passed away or moved, and we lost contact with them. But what we did collect, we have, with the help of Arlington Community Media, Inc., put together this oral history of Cyrus Edwin Dallin. So sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy who this remarkable sculptor really was. Our first remembrance is that of Bernice Hayes Hunt, who lived on Ashland Road in Arlington Heights, and have asked a good friend of mine to read this remembrance for us. Please welcome Amy Ammondson, who you may recognize her from the Robbins Library.
Bernice Hayes Hunt was a former resident of Ashland Road in Arlington Heights and was living in New Pond Village in Walpole, Massachusetts, the day she visited the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum with her daughter, Judy Scherzo of New Jersey. That was in April 2002. Since she did not want to be filmed, the museum recorded her recollections of the time she lived in Arlington and her memories of Cyrus beginning in the early part of 1919 when her family moved here. Bernice remembered distinctly about Cyrus and his shooting his large bow and arrows into the field across the street from his house on Oakland Avenue. She and her family lived on Ashland Road, which is above Oakland Avenue, and so it was natural for children in the neighborhood to observe Cyrus with his big bow, and he offered it to anyone who would like to try it out. It was as big as a man. I can still hear the bow twang, she recalled.
We're going to interrupt Amy Ammondson's reading for a few moments so I can tell you about Cyrus Dallin being a champion archer. Cyrus Edwin Dallin, 1861-1944, was a champion archer. He learned the sport of archery from the native children and braves from the Ute and Paiute nations who lived near his cabin in Springville, Utah during the 1870s. He also did sculptures with an archery theme. You are looking at one now, and it's called the archery lesson. He also gave archery lessons to anyone who wished them up in Arlington Heights. In 1914, the National Archery Association was formed, and they asked Cyrus Dallin to design a gold medal. He did design the gold medal, and when the competitors saw his name on the competition list, they didn't want to compete because he always won the gold medal. He designed a medal for the Newton Archery Club from Newton High School in Newton, Massachusetts. I wonder if they still award it today. In 1941, the National Archery Association decided to redo the medal. So Cyrus Dallin designed this new medal with the last arrow on the front. In 1904, the Olympics Committee decided to have the Olympics in St. Louis, Missouri. Cyrus Dallin was on the United States Olympic archery team. They won the bronze medal in the team competition in archery. The United States Olympic Committee graciously sent us a copy of the medal, which you can see, and which is quite impressive. So we have now a Cyrus Dallin, who was an internationally famous sculptor and painter, a civic-minded citizen, a friend and neighbor, and also an Olympian. And now back to Amy Ammondson reading Beatrice Hunt's Recollections.
Bernice said that Dallin was friendly and very outgoing. Children were always invited to his studio. She said, "I was very shy and my friends were not interested, so we never went. In retrospect, I think, how could I not have done that? I didn't know he was famous. He was just a nice neighbor as far as I knew." She remembered going to the Locke School on Paul Revere Road in Arlington Heights. "I remember our 4th grade in the Assembly Hall. I don't remember Cyrus being there, but there were several statues on the stage." After the Locke School, I went to the Junior High West. I was in the first class to go all the way through the school from the 7th grade. I graduated from there in 1926 and from Arlington High School in 1929. Bernice said, "I remembered Ashland Road had a steep slope, perhaps 19 degrees. Once when the town wanted to buy a new fire engine, they brought it up to our street to test it, make sure it could navigate the hill, since there are so many hills in Arlington Heights. In the winter, we went sledding down Ashland Road through yards, streets, and embankments. We didn't have to worry about cars. We could also ski down, would have to sit down to stop before reaching Paul Revere Road, which was very busy with cars." Bernice recalled, "Gray Street was a wonderful place to coast, though it was too long a walk back, so although we could do it, we didn't go as far as Menotomy Pond. We had flexible flyer sleds in all sizes. Not only in the winter, but in all seasons. We didn't go home until the street lights turned on. On occasion, there were some bad accidents. I recall someone was killed sledding down Appleton Street. For entertainment in the days before television, radio, and cell phones, we played games, talked, sang, and danced. My high school graduation present was a wind-up Victrola record player. Kids came from school walking or went to scout meetings. We played games like charades, hide and seek. We were busy all the time. We also roller skated on Elmore Street. During April, we would make May baskets for everyone, filled with jelly beans and cookies and decorated with crepe paper, and secretly left them on doorsteps. We would go into town and get banana splits from the drugstore for a nickel." Bernice said, "It was a different life now." She remembered one Christmas her father brought home a radio, and her uncle was standing in the living room trying to explain to all his kids how it worked, how those voices got in there. We put our first crystal radio in a big bowl to make it louder. She paused for a few moments and said, "The town seems to have grown up."
When did you move here to Arlington?
In 1927, I believe it was. I was 4 years old. We lived on Mary Street in East Arlington. I rented an apartment. I was the oldest child. My brother, who was 4 years younger, was born there. I went to the Hardy School in kindergarten. And I can remember going across an empty lot on the corner of, Lake Street and Margaret Street and to Hardy School. In the first grade, we moved up to Forest Street. I went to the Pitt School.
Were you married before the Second World War? Or?
No. No, because we graduated from high school in 41.
Oh, okay.
And Everett went into the service in 42, in August of 42. He went into the Marine Corps. He was one of 6 children his father had died in 34, and his mother had raised the 6 children herself.
When you did get married, where did you live?
At first, we lived in his mother's house. His brother had bought the house when he got back from the service. He was unattached, not planning to get married, so he bought the house. And we lived on the 3rd floor. And then we moved up to Charlton Street, up off of Florence Ave. A little bit of a house up there. Yeah.
What was the neighborhood like up there? Because that was developed, kind of later than a lot of the other rest of the town.
It was a settled neighborhood, quiet.
Yeah. Was the area where the Dallin School is now located, was that all open?
Yes, that was all open.
That was all open land?
Like a park.
What about the streets? Were they paved or were they...
Yes, they were rough paved. There were no sidewalks. Not on... we were on Charlton Street.
Right.
There were no sidewalks, but...
Did you ever get a chance to meet Cyrus E. Dallin?
No, I didn't. But his 2 granddaughters, Jean and June, were in my class in junior high. I don't think they graduated high school with us.
Did you ever get a chance to go into his studio?
No.
No? Did you ever see him on the sidewalk or street or road or anything like that?
Not that I realized.
Yeah.
At that age, you're pretty self-absorbed. When you're in high school, that's your whole world.
Right. Were you friendly enough with Jean and June that, that you chummed around together? Or?
No, we didn't.
No.
We were just in high school together, and I knew them, as you know, your classmates.
Right.
We lived in various places. Our living conditions changed as outside circumstances occurred. At the start of the Depression, my father's parents and sister came to live with us, so we moved to a larger house on Forest Street. Then my aunt got married, and my grandfather died in '38, and we moved up to Park Ave Extension. My parents, as many families during that period, adjusted to the circumstances as they came along. That generation lived through 3 wars, really. Tom Brokaw called my generation the greatest generation, but I think not necessarily ours. I think it was our parents' generation that imbued us with the values. Hopefully we carried on. As far as the Depression was concerned, I marvel when I look back that my brother and I, and then my sister came along, she was 10 years younger than I, we weren't affected by it. We lived in a big house on Forest Street, an old house, a big yard to play in.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes.
If there were any worries on my parents' part, we were not aware of it. My father worked for Cadillac Olds. He sold Cadillacs and enjoyed that very much. He was a good salesman. I remember at one point my brother and I discussing, we wondered where the poor farm was. And so we must have heard my mother say that at some point in desperation or something. But that's the only thing I remember. My grandfather kept because he had lost his job, he kept the front half of the yard mowed, and then the back just kind of grew up. But there was a horseshoe court, which he mowed. He had a garden. My grandmother and my mother canned the vegetables from the garden. We had a grape arbor, peach tree, pear trees, and apple trees. I always relished the town hall gardens. I think the town has done a wonderful job, and the Robbins family, in keeping that whole area for the town. When I had children in strollers, why we'd walk over and sit over there by, where I could see the Indian. The kids always loved to walk up around the Indian, and I have great-grandchildren now who, when they come, want to go see the Indian. And they're aware of Squash H.M. Arlington's been a very special place. We moved here in 1950, so we've lived in this section a long time.
It is with great pleasure that I have asked a great-granddaughter of Cyrus Dallin, and who has been a good friend and contributor to the museum, to read a remembrance of her mother, Ruth Dallin Stevenson, entitled Dallin's Studio. Please welcome Pat McCabe of New Hampshire.
I'm going to be reading today from an oral history of Cyrus Dallin and his home that was written by my mother, Ruth Dallin McCabe Stevenson. She was the granddaughter of Cyrus and Vittoria Dallin. Her writings have been edited slightly just to make them flow a little better, but it's pretty much all her own words. So it begins. His house was at the corner of Oakland Avenue and Cliff Street. She notes that Cliff Street was a well-known named street because it was full of cliffs, rocky cliffs. The house had steps leading up from the sidewalk to a wide porch that went almost all around the house. One end was screened and furnished with porch furniture. His house was 69 Oakland Avenue, and across the street was our house at 84 Oakland Avenue. One entered through a glass entry where outside footwear was deposited. Another door opened into a wide hall. To the left was the music room, and to the right the drawing room. This room curved following the curve of the porch. Back of the drawing room was the dining room, with the butler's pantry connecting the dining room to the kitchen. From the hall, one climbed a wide staircase to the landing, which had a suit of armor and my grandmother's cedar chest. Grandpa put an Indian mask for a face on the armor, and at night I was terrified to go by it. The guest bedroom was on the left, and then the library. It had a round table over which hung a big Tiffany lamp. A large fireplace, bookcases lined the wall. Many of the books were about Indians or written by Indians. His desk was in the corner overlooking the street. Here he wrote business letters and letters to friends and relatives. I might note that he had many letters from his family asking for money. So much of his money went out to Utah to help family members. He also built a house for his mother in Springville. She originally was living in a 2-room cabin and raised all of her children in that cabin. So when he could, he built her the house. Cyrus read extensively and loved this room. It was here that he liked to play cards in front of the fire. It was usually a simple game like double Canfield. He made up the rules, and we played by his rules. Naturally, he won, and although we knew he cheated, we let him win. I really think he did this to see if we would let him get away with it, and we always let him, so he was happy. My grandmother's sewing room was between the library and the master bedroom. The 3rd floor had a large billiard table and his bows and arrows, as well as his target. For relaxation, he would either play billiards or use his bows and arrows. About the first thing I remember about my grandparents was being taught to read by my grandmother. She chose as a text the Song of Hiawatha by Longfellow. I can still remember the opening lines, and I remember as a child she used to quote those lines to me. It stayed with her all of her life. Her grandmother had been a school teacher. When she and my grandfather were courting, he would write her from Utah, and she would return his letters correcting the spelling and grammar. He never resented this and used her suggestions in subsequent letters. My grandmother, whom he referred to as his little Dresden doll, smoothed his rough edges, and he could converse with family and clients with ease. I remember him as a polished, well-spoken gentleman. As she was a teacher, and as his schooling was very limited, her assistance helped him immeasurably. I remember him speaking perfect English, and as he had beautiful manners, he was able to hold his own with others and in time with clients. He always said he got his love of beauty from his mother. His father worked a small gold mine, and because he resigned from the Mormon church, he was unable to hire Mormon workers, so he had to depend on his sons. Thus, one day, when Cyrus was helping to remove clay from the mine, he molded his first head. Now for my remembrances of the studio. It was only a short distance from the house. It was a fairly long wooden structure attached to the garage. One gained entrance by going up a couple of steps and turning right and entering through a door. A big cherry tree guarded the entrance. On entering, the first thing one would see would be a large wooden box holding his plasticine, the medium he used to make his models. As your eye scanned the room, you would see several pedestals holding figures on them. A bust of his mother and father in marble, a World War I figure. It may have depicted my Uncle Arthur, as he was an ambulance driver during that war. Abraham Lincoln, and others that I cannot name now. His working table had a top that could be turned easily. You might even see him on a ladder with a larger-than-life piece. He had a pail of plasticine on the paint shelf. Of course, he worked from an armature, loading that with medium and working away to refine the piece with his modeling tools. This was the room the boys came into after school. Many afternoon, my husband's cousins were among the group. He handed each of them a hunk of plasticine and told them to make something with it, but be quiet and let him work. They all loved him and called him Grandpa Dallin, as did everyone in the neighborhood. At my 50th high school reunion, several of the men came up to me and recalled the days they spent at his feet. He always worked in a greenish smock, wore a tam that my grandmother crocheted for him. She kept him supplied with tams. My grandmother started a hobby club for the boys, and my father and other neighborhood kids belonged. My father developed a keen interest in radio, and not only was a hobby, but he used it in his business life also. He had many inventions dealing with radios, including transistor radios and radar. And I remember as a kid when we went to visit my grandmother and grandfather, he was always on his radio. It was one of the enduring hobbies that he had. My grandmother also started the Women's Club and the Study Club. My grandparents were entertained a great deal, so in order to repay these social obligations, she would have formal teas. We 3 girls were asked to help by handing around cups of tea and passing cookies and cakes. My grandfather always attended, and he would always take a group through the studio. Thanksgiving was celebrated at their house. My father had to drive to Beacon Hill to pick up Grandma's 2 sisters, and as long as he lived, the brother also. One of my great aunts couldn't resist needling Grandmother, who would burst into tears and have to leave the table. We had about 13 at the table and only 1 maid. And as Grandma insisted on formal service, it took a long time to be served. When we were old enough, we helped by passing vegetables, etc. Finger bowls always completed the dinner. I forgot to tell you that he placed an Indian on the high cliff at the back of the garden called, I think, the Last Arrow. It was only plaster, but it stayed there for several years before it literally washed away. We did have many cliffs around. I think he selected the property because it reminded him of his beloved Wasatch Mountains in Utah. He painted these mountains several times. Perhaps I can tell you a bit about the man. He was not very tall and he used a cane only to point at something. I told you about the time at the Art Museum when he shook his cane and said, "That's not art." Many Sunday afternoons we would drive Grandpa and our family to the Art Museum and follow him around, listening to him talk about the paintings. A group of people always followed us. Another example of how he interacted with children in the neighborhood, he came upon a group of boys throwing stones in the woods, and he said to them, "See how I throw?" And then he proceeded to draw a circle on one of the trees and throw a stone, hitting the middle of the target. The boys thought that looked like fun and tried it, and decided that was what they wanted to do. Coming home at night from the Art Museum, he would wait at Harvard Square for the Arlington Heights trolley car, or streetcar. I also used to take the same streetcar. He usually got there before I did, so when I got on, no seats. I would spot him and hold on to the back of his seat so we could talk. He would not let me stand. After I said no a couple of times, he said, "A gentleman never sits when a lady is standing." So that was that. After we got to the last stop at Arlington Heights, we would walk home together. My mother was a good cook, and when she made an apple pie, she would phone Grandpa to say his piece was waiting for him, so he would come over and enjoy a piece of pie and cheese. My mother always ate cheese with her apple pie. My grandmother would not serve apple pie. She considered it Parisian. Many times I would go over in the afternoon and check what they were having for dinner. If it was better than our menu, I'd call home and tell Mother I was staying for dinner. So you see, there was a lot of travel between the 2 houses. He told a story about a trip east with a chief and many of his Indians. After they went through the first tunnel, Grandpa looked around. No Indians. All, including the chief, were under their seats. Grandpa tried to explain to the chief using sign language. So after the second tunnel, The chief was sitting, grabbing the arms of the seat so hard his hands were white, and all the other Indians were again under their seats. They were going to see the great white father in Washington. He and Martin Bovey were close friends and traveled one year to Utah together. Martin lived next to us, and he skied our driveway and built a jump at the end. When Arthur started his stained glass business, he used part of the studio. First, he built a second floor over the garage, which he used for his office and workroom. He hung the cartoons for display. Then, if accepted, he would cut the glass on a long table on the floor of the garage. His kiln was on the back wall of the garage. The glass was painted on to get the proper colors he needed, and then it was fired in the kiln, taken out, leaded, and returned to the kiln. He had a flourishing business when the Second World War broke out, and because he was a French citizen as well as an American, he chose to heed the call to the colors. He was 40 years old and too old to join the regular French army, so he joined the French Foreign Legion. He was killed and left a family who mourned him, and he was lost also to the art world. My grandparents never got over his needless death. They tried to stop him from going, but of course didn't succeed. He never married. It just left the rest of the family to miss him. Ruth Dallin Stevenson.
I was born in Arlington, November 30th, 1929. I went to the Pierce School, Junior High West and Arlington High School. It wasn't rural, but it was quiet. You stayed in town for the most part. We had public transportation, so you could travel a lot, but we walked a lot. We would walk up to the reservoir and swim, and we walked all over town. It was just something you did then, something kids don't do now. And we played in the neighborhood a lot. You did a lot of things with the children in your neighborhood. Everybody, boys and girls. Whether you skated, played baseball, and we could sled until 5 o'clock at night. This was before World War II, and a lot of people were still in the Depression. And then when World War II came along, nobody really drove a car often. But I lived at the base of overlooking Ronald Road. And that was quite a steep hill. I was about 10, so I'd say, I think around 10, about 1939. I used to take my younger brother and we'd walk up to his studio, which is in a barn.
Right.
And if he was working, we were allowed to go in. He would stop work and he would give us clay to mold in our hands. And he was working on a very large piece. It was covered with damp canvas, and he would take the canvas off and let us look at it. And Mrs. Dallin would come in. She'd bring cookies and lemonade. And I think he wore a smock sometimes. And was it a beret?
Yes.
Yes. And he took a lot of time and spent it with the children, which was very exciting for us. This was a celebrity. A few years ago, we went on a Johnny Appleseed tour out toward the middle part of the state. And one of the stops was a small village where there were a group of artisans. And we went in the sculptor studio, and I spoke with a sculptor. I'd seen, he did mainly Indians. The eyes on the Indians were distinct, not like some of the other sculptors. You could see each fold in the eyelid. I told him they looked like the eyes on Cyrus Dallin's Indians. They were sort of distinctive. And he said, I studied under Cyrus Dallin. We were quite surprised because so many people haven't heard of him.
Did Cyrus any time, talk with you? Or?
Yes, he would stop and talk with us. And he had some sort of a dedication, something that was next to the town hall. Probably sometime early 40s. I was still young. But I remember he told us about it, and my brother and I went. There was a good crowd there.
Do you remember any pieces in particular that you saw, either in the studio or, in the neighborhood?
Well, the Indian monotony, that was one. That was the most impressive. Then we stopped going. I don't know if we grew up, or of course, by then you were teens,
right?
And you did other things. But it was a nice town to grow up in. We were very fortunate.
Someone sent the museum a small section of a chapter of a book. There are sermons and stories by William L. Stidger entitled You Can Never Tell. I have asked one of the museum's docents to read this for us, and so let's welcome Peter Middleton.
The long-lost dollar has come back to the fold. With silver you can turn your dreams to gold. Oh, we're in the money. We're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along. We're in the money. The sky is sunny. Oh, man, depression, you are through. You done us wrong. Oh, we never see headline about red line today.
Cyrus Dallin, the sculptor who created the appeal to the Great Spirit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, was working in his studio one day when a simply dressed woman came in. Mr. Dallin paid little attention to her and went on with his work. Presently, she saw one of his major statues called The Last Arrow and asked how much it would cost. Mr. Dallin, thinking she was ignorant of the cost of major sculpture pieces, smiled condescendingly and said, "Lady, that is a museum piece. You can't afford to own that one." Then, thinking to suggest something within her means, he showed her several small items, which he often sold to casual visitors in his studio. But she again said, "Nevertheless, I'd like to know what that statue would cost." Once again, Mr. Dallin courteously but firmly said, "But madam, that is a museum piece, or a statue that only a city could afford to buy for some public park." And he tried to turn her mind in more humble directions. However, that woman determined to know what that statue could be purchased for. Finally, Mr. Dallin, to humor the whim of a childish woman, said, "Oh, that statue would cost around $15,000. "All right, I'll take it," she replied. Without batting an eyelash, he sat down at his studio desk and wrote him a check for it, adding, "Send it to my estate in Madison, New Jersey." That particular lady happened to be Mrs. Geraldine Rockefeller Dodge, daughter of the famous John D. Rockefeller, and the statue adorned her driveway. Mr. Dallin has not recovered from the shock he got that day when he says, "I was entertaining a financial angel unawares." In 1975, Mrs. Geraldine R. Dodge died, and her estate was put up for auction. A collector purchased the last arrow, or as it is sometimes called, the passing of the buffalo. It's now located in the Dr. Edward M. Ball Park in Muncie, Indiana, which also has a copy of Dallin's The Appeal to the Great Spirit.
Let's let it, set it, rollin' around.
I was born in 1929. My family were living in Arlington Heights on Oakland Avenue, right across the street from Mr. Dallin. When I was a little boy, aged 4 and 5, I used to go across to Mr. Dallin's studio and watch him painting and sculpting, and what intrigued me, working on stained glass windows. But my family decided to move out of Arlington, and they bought a house in Carlisle over on West Street. An old, very old house that they rolled across the street and rebuilt there. But that was in 1934 when I was 5 years old. But my family had been good friends of Mr. Dallin, and they invited he and his wife out to have dinner with us more than once in Carlisle. And that was, we were 3 boys, and we would be invited to join the dinner, which was very interesting indeed.
It's funny how a scene recalls a favorite dream, a dream that
Mr. Dallin, one time he was out, he painted a picture of an old barn that was on our property. This painting was done of a barn we had, an old barn we had on our property in Carlisle. The house was down to the left and the road was went by it up to the right. And he just sat out there one day and painted it, and we were all absolutely thrilled. Unfortunately, the barn burned down years thereafter. One day in the springtime, Mr. Dallin was out with us, and he decided to paint this beautiful flowering apple tree. and I went down and watched him do it. When he finished, he said, "To Bill, C.E. Dallin." I'm very proud of that. Well, it was a real joy, and we certainly felt that way about him. I mean, how often do you meet people of international fame who are especially in artist-type people, and especially the kind of art that I can tolerate? One thing Mr. Dallin did, we were 3 boys, and was to give us some miniature statues of his. Whether Dad had to pay for them or not, I don't know, but this is an Indian of which we have all seen. And in 1946, my dad sent me a postcard from Kansas City, or sent to my wife, and there is another Dallin statue that was up in Kansas City. Looked very familiar.
Yeah, it's called the Scout.
The Scout, that's right.
It's on Penn Hill in Kansas City, Missouri.
That's wonderful. This is one of my choice items, and I leave it on a desk on top of the card, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have them.
Did you, by any chance, get back to see Dallin working in his studio when you were like a teenager or an adult?
No, unfortunately I didn't. Other things seemed to be occupying my mind at the time, and I just didn't think of it. Had I thought of it, I think I would have loved to have done it again. I would have appreciated what he was doing a lot more than I did when I was 5 or 6. He was a pleasure to know, and even without being as famous as he was or has become, he was just a delightful gentleman, and I always enjoyed it when he came out to have dinner with us.
Forevermore the memory. Please have them play it again. And I remember just when I've heard that lovely song before.
It was a delight to know him.
Our next reading is from an article that was written in the Plymouth Society News, Remembering Cyrus Dallin, by Dorothy Kelso. And it gives me great pleasure to have you welcome Geraldine Geri Tremblay, founder, along with me, and president of the Board of Directors of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum and former Latin teacher of Arlington High School, to read it for us.
Does every Pilgrim Hall docent have a favorite artifact? Mine is a small statue of Massasoit, the miniature version of the towering Coles Hill landmark. The little museum figure touches me for its grace, its lithe youthfulness, and something more. When I stand before it, I'm transported to an ice blue studio and a magical afternoon with Cyrus Dallin, the sculptor. The Dallins lived in Arlington Heights, Massachusetts, just a few doors from my mother's family. The parents were friends. The kids all scuffled downhill to school together. One October in the early 1930s, my mother and I were in Arlington visiting my grandparents. The Dallins, being especially fond of my mother, asked us to tea. Mrs. Dallin greeted us at the door, a chilly lady, cold roast Boston, dressed in the style of Queen Mary with a collar of filigree lace. She ushered us into a room full of antiques, spindly chairs, frail tables, eggshell china, a minefield for a clumsy, nearsighted child struggling to unstrap the red buttons on my brown leather gloves. I could only hope for invisibility. On the far side of the room, a man rose from a rocking chair. This, I know, was Arthur Dallin, my mother's particular childhood pal. Arthur had been an ambulance driver in France in World War I and still suffered from badly frozen feet. He hobbles, my grandmother cautioned. Don't stare, ducky. Between the tea ceremony and grown-up talk, Arthur, a distinguished stained glass artist, was talking about his latest project. I sneaked a peek at his shoes. They were definitely odd, deeply cracked, laced high over his ankles, but polished to a fierce gloss. Just then the parlor door opened. In trotted a small man, neat little pointed beard, rimless glasses. So ordinary, I was quite disappointed. He didn't look at all like an artist, let alone somebody who had been born in a log cabin in Utah when it was Indian country. As soon as he recognized my mother, his face lit up. The moment tea was over, he swept us away from the parlor, down a long back corridor to his studio. At the door, he paused to don a smock and a beret, and so became, in a wink, the artist. Inside the studio, cavernous, blue in the October dusk, smelling of wet clay, another transformation, this time to wizard. He pranced around, waving his hands over swathed shapes, bodiless heads with blank eyes and chunks of white marble. I was invited to touch, but the deathly chill made me recoil with a shudder. The sculptor gave me a reassuring pat and asked if I ever played with clay. He explained he did because he had to practice before doing statues in marble. He then unwrapped several heads, mainly children, but I think accidentally revealed a male Native American's face, so tortured and tragic I see it to this day in my dreams. Gradually, the spookiness of the place wore off. I could see the high work tables were filled with tools. This was a shop, not really so different from my inventor father's. As I wandered about, my mother asked Mr. Dallin if he remembered a long ago family picnic. It was a story I knew and loved. The party was arranged by Mrs. Dallin in honor of 3 Native Americans in the cast of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, then touring Boston. All the children were invited. My mother and her 4 siblings brought the strawberry ice cream, which in those days had to be hand-turned. Hard work with a few fights over the dasher, but eventually everybody got a lick. At the party, the strawberry ice cream was a hit. However, Mr. Dallin's eyes fixed on Native Americans let his melt in the dish. The children were very shocked. How the little sculptured cowed with laughter. He told us that one of the Indians later modeled for him. Someone, perhaps Arthur Dallin, took photographs that summer day. I remember them as lovely, soft focus with silvery grasses on the hillside and the 3 visitors in native dress. They were such beautiful people, my mother said softly. By now the light had faded and it was time to go. Once again I wrestled with the red button gloves, and worried whether the occasion called for saying goodbye with a curtsy or a handshake. Cyrus Dallin solved the problem by gently taking my hand in both of his. Rustling through the oak leaves on the dark walk to my grandparents' house, somehow I lost a glove, the left one. "Never mind," said my grandmother. "It is the other one that touched the hand of a famous artist." For many decades, I kept that right glove. A decade later, things were sadly changed for the Dallins. The sculptor's work fell out of fashion. The gifted, beloved son died fighting in France with the Foreign Legion in World War II. The heartbroken father did not long survive him. In 1945, the ice blue studio was destroyed by fire. Yet, out of so many losses, so long a neglect, another transformation. The works of Cyrus Dallin from Indian country are reaching a new generation. What he glimpsed of the Native American triumph and tragedy is a truth whose time has come.
I went to the Lawrence Public Schools for elementary and for high school, and I was accepted at the Massachusetts College of Art. I started in the fall of 1934, and I graduated in the spring of 1938. There was a modeling department there, and there was a Mr. Raymond Porter, who was the chair of that particular department, and Cyrus Dallin worked along with him. We were exposed to all the different forms of art, modeling being one, and Cyrus Dallin was my teacher for that particular course. Mr. Dallin, at various lessons, would just have us do several little things that we would model, and to climax the course, we all made a mask. and we had a choice of doing what we wanted to. And I chose to do a stylized rabbit. And I can remember Cyrus Dallin coming up to me and saying, "Get some more clay on there. You don't have enough clay." And then finally I would get more clay on and he would punch it a little bit and say, "See what I mean? You got to get it up there." And I had it around the house for a long, long while, and finally it gave up the ghost. But the interesting thing about Cyrus Dallin at that particular time, he always looked like an artist. We had a lot of other teachers in the school, but Cyrus was the one that had the goatee, the beret, the smock. He was about 75 years old when I was there. Everyone knew who he was because of the appeal to the Great Spirit in front of the museum. And we were all in awe of him. But he would come up to us sometimes and he'd call us, "Now child, do this." Or, "Boy, I want you to do this."
Straighten up and fly right. Straighten up and fly right. Straighten up and fly right. Cool down, Papa, don't you blow your top.
He never knew me by name. I was just a young person who was, trying to learn a few things about modeling. I found him to be very, very gentle and concerned, wanting you to get off on the right foot and to enjoy what you were doing. I have the yearbooks for the 4 years I was there. It's amazing. In all the 4 years, they say about the same thing about Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, we are proud to claim him as one of us. It said, distinguished gentleman, nationally known, calls everyone child in a fatherly fashion as he shapes the student's lump of clay into a real nose, is one of the artists to have studied under when we are trying to make an impression. This autumn, Cyrus E. Dallin completed his Paul Revere. He has turned again to his original design and has completed a powerful equestrian. Our modeling class was fortunate enough to see it in clay at his studio. Cyrus the Great, whose glorious ability gave us much famous Indian sculpture, and the recently unveiled statue of Paul Revere guides our unaccustomed fingers in making the clay round and building it up. My wife always tells me that every time we go by the appeal to the Great Spirit, I used to say so often, my teacher did that. Now when my children go by the statue, they say, my father's teacher did that.
In 1998, shortly after we opened the museum, Eleanor B. Spinney of Chelmsford, Massachusetts, sent us the following story she had of visiting Dallin's home and studio as he was working on her grandfather's, George Hunt Barton's, bas-relief, the first president of the Children's Museum in Boston. I've asked the chairman of the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum Board of Trustees to read it for us. Please welcome Sarah Burks.
This is a remembrance of Eleanor B. Spinney of Dartmouth Court in Bedford, Massachusetts, presented in November 1998 in a letter that she mailed to the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum. I read with interest the article about the Dallin Museum in the Sunday Globe. I have a memory of Mr. Dallin that I have been wanting to share with someone who might appreciate it. So here goes. I'm a woman now 78 years old. When I was in my mid-teens, which would make it about 1935, Mr. Dallin was commissioned to do a bas-relief sculpture of my grandfather, George Hunt Barton, for the Boston Children's Museum. As first president, Gramps' bas-relief has hung at the entrance of the museum ever since, first in Jamaica Plain and now in Boston. When the bas-relief was about finished, Mr. Dallin asked my mother and me to come to his studio. I can see him now in beret and smock, the studio full of wonderful things. The bas-relief stood covered with a cloth, and Mr. Dallin explained to me that when he uncovered it, he wanted me, as beloved granddaughter, to blurt out immediately whether or not this is truly my grandfather. He then pulled off the cover and I answered, "Almost." Then Mr. Dallin asked what was not quite right, and I explained that Gramp should look as though he were about to smile at me. Mr. Dallin was ecstatic and proceeded to add a bit of a smile line at the mouth and eyes, and now I could proclaim it was my Gramp. Then Mother and I admired the model of the Paul Revere statue, standing there, and Mr. Dallin launched into a tale I shall never forget. I truly believe that even with the passage of 60 years, I have it pretty straight. He told us how he, as a young man, new to the area, won the competition for a Paul Revere sculpture in Copley Square, much to the consternation of the local art community. The statue had never been cast, and it was obvious this was a sorrow for him. He went on to tell how James Michael Curley, the governor, had discovered the story of the uncast and never erected statue. Mr. Curley had come to Mr. Dallin and asked how much it would cost to have this done, and went away saying it would be done. Shortly, Mr. Dallin saw a bill before the state legislature for twice as much as the figure Mr. Dallin gave Curley. Mr. Dallin got a hold of Mr. Curley and asked, "How come?" Curley's answer was that Dallin should keep still. He would get his statue, and what happened to the other half of the money should be none of his business. Mr. Dallin was irate and refused to be party to such a deal. That is how things stood when Mother and I were there. I remember how glad we were to see that the statue had been erected. I forgot who was governor, but we figured Mr. Dallin was satisfied he was honest. I shall try to come by someday to see the museum, and I do wish you much success in assembling as much about him as possible. He was a talented artist who needs to be better known.
A one-paragraph handwritten paper was sent to the museum, and it was written by Mrs. Mary Dick, who was a member of the Arlington Women's Club, about her experience of posing for Cyrus Dallin in his studio. You have the pleasure of myself to read it for you.
Everybody loves a baby, that's why I'm in love with you. Pretty baby, and I'd like to be your sister, brother, dad, and mother too. Pretty baby, pretty baby.
The following is a very short remembrance, and I mean short, by Mary Dick, wife of John Dick of Arlington. She was requested to recall what her life was like growing up in Arlington between 1910 and 1920 by one of her maternal granddaughters. It was just one paragraph, but it says a lot. The Women's Club of Arlington filled quite a place in my life for many years, and I often took part in the shows they put on. One of them was a masque written by Mrs. Vittoria Colonna Murray Dallin, in which I took the part of Diana. Mrs. Dallin loaned me her husband's bow and arrow and quivers of arrows for the occasion, he formerly being a champion archer. As a sequel to this, Mr. Dallin asked me to pose for the head and neck of a figure in a group he was doing for a girls' school in St. Louis, Missouri. It was called Alma Mater, and of course I found it a thrilling experience to watch the famous sculptor at work in his studio. Mrs. Vittoria Colonna Dallin produced and wrote many pageants for the town of Arlington and also for the Boston Girls' School, where she was a student and then also a teacher. She used to put the pageants on over by the Mystic Lakes. Some of them were even at the Arlington Town Hall Gardens. Mr. Dallin was a bronze winner in the 1904 Olympics in archery, and his bas-relief of Alma Mater was for St. Mary's College for Women in St. Louis, Missouri.
Everybody loves a baby, that's why I'm in love with you. Pretty baby, and I'd like to be your sister, brother, dad, and mother too. Pretty baby, won't you come and let me rock you in my cradle of love, and we'll cuddle all the time. Oh, I want to love and baby, and it might as well be you. Pretty baby of mine.
Since the next remembrance was written by a teenager, Katherine Xenos, for her diary, I asked ACMI News anchor Summer Maxwell to read it for us. So please welcome Summer Maxwell.
Tuesday, October 1st, 1940. Dear Diary, after school today, I went with a group and my art teacher to Mr. Dallin's house. He is a great sculptor who has made the statue of Massasoit that is in Plymouth, Mass, and the Indian Medicine Man, the appeal to the Great Spirit, that's in front of the Boston Art Museum, and a statue of Paul Revere that he just sold to Boston. He was a kind old man, 79 years old. He told us about his childhood days, how he played with Indians. He loved Indians, and as a boy, always played with Indian children. He said Indians are the kindest people, and they always have a dog. He also said that the Indians consider it a crime to whip a child. Indians would kill people because we never had a flag which they considered as a peace flag. He had a statue of his mother and father, and a painting of himself that he did, and many little statues. He was making a model of a knight with armor on a horse. It was of stuff almost like clay, the challenge. He was a kind old man, and I'll never forget him. He lives in Arlington Heights, Massachusetts.
A wonderful article from the Local Observer number 3 and written by Ruby Von Dwarnick about a beautiful creation of Cyrus Dallin was sent to us many years ago, and I've asked one of our local firefighters to read it for us. So please welcome Brian Sweeney.
This is the time of year in which people think of angels a little more than usual. In keeping with the spirit of this special holiday season, I thought I would write about one angel of particular interest to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you are familiar with what Massachusetts and Utah share culturally, then you may have already guessed that I am talking about the Angel Moroni. Cyrus Dallin was born in Springville, Utah on November 22, 1861. His parents had joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in England and emigrated to Utah and eventually left the church and became Presbyterian. Cyrus was very talented, and as a teen he would sketch and work with clay. One day a few men from Boston who were working near his father's silver mine noticed his excellent craftsmanship. They suggested Cyrus go to Boston and study with an artist on Tremont Street, which he did. Things were not turning out as he had planned. The artist and he did not agree, and he left the studio and became a starving artist. He eventually began to work in terracotta factory in Quincy. With scraps of terracotta, he began to sculpt panthers from a sketch he made from a famous painting he once saw. People began admiring the panthers, and before long he was selling them. A popular philanthropist in Boston at the time was impressed with Cyrus Dallin's talent and paid for him to go to Paris and study. After 2 years, Cyrus returned to Boston and spent the remainder of his life visiting Utah on occasion. He entered a sculpture in the World Fair in 1893 and won a gold medal for his work. Its name was Signal of Peace, and it resides in Chicago's Lincoln Park. His career was respectfully underway. President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, William Woodruff, knew that Cyrus's parents used to be members of the church, and he approached Cyrus Dallin about sculpting the Angel Moroni to be placed atop the Salt Lake City Temple. Cyrus declined, saying, "I don't believe in angels." His mother encouraged him to accept the commission and reminded him that he must believe in angels since he referred to his mother as his angel mother. He began studying the scriptures for inspiration. His design was a dignified neoclassical angel in robe and cap, standing upright with a trumpet in hand. The original 1-meter plaster model was completed in October 1891, and a full-size model was sent to Salem, Ohio, where the statue was hammered out of copper and covered with 22-karat gold leaf. The 3.8-meter statue stands on a stone ball on the 64-meter center spire on the east side. He is quoted as saying, "I consider that my Angel Moroni brought me nearer to God than anything I ever did." He also said, "It seemed to me that I came to know what it means to commune with angels from heaven." Cyrus Dallin made his home in Arlington, Mass., less than 1 mile from where the Boston, Massachusetts Temple stands today. Since Massachusetts and Utah share a legacy of this gifted artist, the church had another Angel Moroni made from the original mold to adorn the Boston Temple. Both places he called home not only share the Angel Moroni, but several of his other works as well. In Utah, there is a statue of the Native American Chief Massasoit in front of the State House in Salt Lake City, which is a replica of the one in Plymouth. The large statue in the center of Salt Lake City of Brigham Young, with different scenes on each side, one depicting a trapper, is also a work of Cyrus Dallin. A few famous pieces in Boston include the statue of the Native American on a horse with his arms stretched out wide, the Appeal to the Great Spirit, located in front of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The famous statue of Paul Revere in Boston's North End, Dallin's final artistic achievement was to see that Revere statue in its proper place before his death. There is the Cyrus Dallin Museum in Arlington, Mass., open to the public, and admission is by donation. The church donated an original copy of the mold of Angel Moroni to the museum, and by written request of a local firefighter and a friend of his, who are members of the church made a financial contribution as well. The Cyrus Dallin Museum was very excited to have Dallin's Angel Moroni chosen for the Boston Temple. When the temple was being built, plans were underway to have a copy of the original sculpture in gold leaf on display in the garden of the museum until it would be placed on top of the steeple. However, those plans were changed to ensure the integrity of the statue when the statue and the steeple were met with such strong opposition. The museum understood and was saddened by the reaction by its neighbors and of the church in Belmont, Mass. In 1944, at the age of 82, Cyrus died at his home in Arlington Heights, Mass. The Springville Museum quotes the following: "The sculptor is often remembered for his words he spoke on his final trip west in 1942. I have received 2 college degrees besides medals galore, but my greatest honor of all is that I came from Utah."
Just recently, as the result of a preview on the news program of ACMI, a wonderful copy of a letter was sent to us and written by Michel Garaipy. It is filled with a lot of information of what life was like in 1923, living down the street from Cyrus Dallin. I have asked Michel's niece, who was sent the letter, to read it for us. So please welcome Marjorie Brown.
This letter was sent to me by my Uncle Al. It is dated November 5th, 1995. Dear Marjorie, in 1923, when I was 10 years old, my family moved to Arlington from a rented apartment in Somerville, Mass. The family consisted of my grandfather, grandmother, father and mother, sister, 2 brothers younger than I, a total of 8 people. The adults pooled their resources and purchased an 8-room house located at 66 Appleton Street. There were 4 bedrooms and a bathroom on the 2nd floor, and a kitchen, dining room, living room with a fireplace, and a front hall, plus a big attic, great for storage and hobbies. There was also a sun porch off the 2nd floor. Quite a change from a rental in Somerville. I lived there until I got married in 1941. And eventually, after several short-term living arrangements in various parts of New England, Carolyn and I moved to a house at 24 Locke Street, Arlington Heights. Interestingly, it was within walking distance of my boyhood home. I lived at 24 Locke for 47 years. Now for the Paul Revere connection. I don't know if this is still the case, but for many, many years, it was the custom on April 19th to select someone to impersonate Revere dressed in colonial attire and have him ride on horseback through Boston, Somerville, Medford, Arlington, Lexington, and Concord, following the route originally traveled by Paul Revere. He was accompanied by a retinue of motorcycle cops, politicians, etc., etc., and people with their kids would line the route to see him dash by. When he went through Arlington, he followed Mass Ave, except for a short portion from St. James Church, now St. Athanasius, where he would take to Appleton Street, merge into Paul Revere Road, and then rejoin Mass Ave. This was because that was the original route that Revere took as it existed then. The nice part for our family was that all we had to do on the 19th was to put out the flag and sit on the front porch, waiting for the Revere impersonator to gallop by. It was the task of the Boy Scouts on the 19th to position themselves at the junction of Appleton Street and Mass Ave, opposite what is now St. Athanasius, and make sure he would leave the avenue and take to Appleton Street. One year, in spite of that precaution, he missed out and went straight up the avenue. It was always a different rider, so one can't blame them for a small error. Now for the Dallin connection. Cyrus Dallin, his wife Vittoria, and his son Arthur lived on the corner of Oakland Ave and Cliff Street, opposite the end of Gray Street. Next to the house was a huge studio, 1/3 of which was used by Arthur to carry on his life work, the design and fabrication of stained glass windows. Most of Cyrus Dallin's studio work took place on weekends and school vacations, since he was a teacher at the Massachusetts College of Art, then on Brookline Ave, Boston. Because neither his wife Vittoria nor Cyrus owned a car, they relied on taxis to do local trips and public transportation to get to Boston. Since the college hours were 9 to 3, it meant Cyrus had to get up real early to get through breakfast and head for school. He would walk down Oakland Ave from his home, turn left at my corner house, go a few steps along Appleton Street, and turn right at Daniel Street, finally reaching Mass Ave, where he would board a trolley, later a bus, and proceed to Harvard Square. From thence to Park Street under, and so on, eventually landing at the school. It was a good 1.5-hour trip, and he was no spring chicken. Because school was over at 3 p.m., he avoided the hassle of rush hour on the subway. Often, as he was walking up Oakland Ave on the return trip, he would spot my grandfather trimming the hedges or rose bushes. Cyrus had heard through the grapevine that my grandpa was a professional woodcarver, and a friendly relationship was established between the two. On the road, he wore conventional clothing, but as soon as he entered the school, he would discard his outer clothing and put on a smock and beret, looking for all the world like a French artist on the left bank. Cyrus welcomed youngsters from the neighborhood to his studio and taught us how to model in clay, how to make plastic casts from the model, and, if we could afford it, have the casts turned into bronze by professional metal casters. I suspect most of the things that will be housed in the new museum will be the intermediate plaster casts. Plaster casts can also be duplicated in marble, but here again, this was done by professional marble workers. In the good old days, sculptors did their own marble work, as, for example, did Michelangelo. Whenever us kids used to visit Dallin in the studio or his home, he would regale us with stories about the Indians he grew up with. His son, Arthur Dallin, was born in France when the Dallins were living in Paris. Technically, he was therefore a citizen of France. He could speak French as fluently as English, and carried on many a discussion in French about art in Canada with my mother, who graduated with a bachelor's degree in art education. When World War II broke out, his love for France was so great that he joined the French army as a volunteer and, unfortunately, was killed in one of the battles that took place just before the Germans invaded Paris. When I grew up at 66 Appleton Street, the only library facility we had at Arlington Heights was a tiny room located in the Lock School, a room no larger than a living room. It was Vittoria Dallin's dream and aspiration that an adequate solution to this was to have a separate building erected on the corner of Park Ave and Paul Revere Road. After many years of prodding the public and petitioning the powers that be, this finally came about, resulting in the erection of a suitable building. Unfortunately, after several years, the town was down on its luck and closed all the branch libraries. Vittoria would have turned over in her grave had she known this. It was never opened up again as a library, and hence the plan to make it a Dallin Museum.
A good neighbor of the Dallin Museum, who had a business next door to the museum called the Boston Restorations, and an oil painter as well, sent this reflection, Cyrus Dallin, A Quiet Voice in the Wilderness, to the museum in 2012. And I've asked him to read these wonderful thoughts for us. So please welcome Neil Dale.
It could be that an artist affects their times through some exciting synergy between their work, their lifestyle, and the fashion of the times. We hear about the Impressionists and maybe even long for their riotous evenings in Paris. But that time is long past, and it probably has very little effect on our culture anymore. Now, however, we can perhaps get the real effect of the artist as people pause, one by one, and are moved by their paintings. This is a direct emotional communication and transmits the actual intention of the artist and the real effect of their art on our time. In Boston, there's a sculpture that has been having a profound effect on the visitors to the Museum of Fine Arts for over 100 years, known as the Appeal to the Great Spirit. It is a full-scale bronze of a Native American on a horse, his arms wide. He leans back, opening his heart to the heavens above. It is green with age and exposure because it is entirely appropriately outdoors, under the elements and the sky. This is a sculpture that has greeted visitors to the museum since 1910, and from all accounts, it is the best-loved sculpture in Boston. It is said to be, after the Daniel French sculpture of Lincoln seated in his memorial in Washington, D.C., the most photographed sculpture in the United States. How strange that almost nobody knows which artist created it. Beside any of the paintings inside the museum, one glances without fail at the tag that announces the artist. In front of the appeal, however, people stop and gaze and then move on, receiving its gift of inspiration with almost the same unconscious acceptance as they take in the sky above it. And it has been having an effect. Bit by bit, person by person, Cyrus Dallin has been selflessly reminding us of the world above us and the Native Americans who valued it. There is no accident that scarcely anybody knows who did this. The surrender of the rider is not one of the overt values of the American spirit. Still, in the privacy of our hearts, we may love it and know that there is truth in this profound gesture of appeal. Americans of Dallin's era preferred the active, swashbuckling style of Frederick Remington and other Western artists. To this day, Remington's work and name applaud the romantic images of the combative, dominating, totally independent cowboy. But as Jonathan Fairbanks, curator emeritus of decorative arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, in Boston, said in a lecture, "Cyrus Dallin was born in the West. He knew too much to think that such brash images were the reality." Not only did Dallin avoid that stereotype, he saw in the Native Americans values that he felt were much deeper and more sincere. These are not the motives of the men who tamed the West, nor the culture that has conquered nature. Rather, his sculptures speak of reverence, humility, inspiration, and a deep emotional awareness of another's pain. In a park in Philadelphia, there's a bronze Native American on a bronze horse. He is ceremonially naked, with his arm raised in a curious, gentle gesture. His hand does not welcome, neither does it try to stop. Only when one contemplates the old man's face can one feel the depth of his pain, his witness to the destruction of his own culture. Then one can hear the words in his gesture, "Peace, enough. Peace, enough." Very few people wanted to hear this message when it was created in 1903. But perhaps now we are more capable of acknowledging the facts that this man has witnessed. In being open to his pain, we can also open the door to feeling the values of his culture. There is a small park in Arlington, Massachusetts, behind the town hall. Grass and bushes flank a broad spillway that falls like a small stream from a rise in the copse of trees behind. It is a beautiful refuge on a summer's day, and the few who know it come there to sit on a stone bench and eat their lunch in sheltered peace. Tucked away in the copse of trees at the top of the rise, there is a bronze hunter, crouching down to scoop a drink from the running stream that is the source of the fountain. Though larger than life size, you could miss this sculpture entirely, because it expresses humility and a simple participation in its natural setting. Alongside this Native American, Dallin has sculpted a dead goose, the hunter's rightful share of the bounty that he inhabits. In 1912, when Dallin sculpted this work, American culture was at the height of its headlong consumption of the resources of a new continent. Only now, as we near the end of this enormous banquet, and begin to consider curbing our appetite, can we discover an artist like Dallin and begin to absorb the values he expressed. Although appreciated for the sheer skill of his sculpture during his life, Dallin's intentions could not be fully appreciated in his own time, and his name has been forgotten. His sculptures stand today in front of a museum in Boston, on a hill overlooking Kansas City, in a park in Philadelphia, and they testify to the values of the culture that we displaced. They show the qualities that we now need to resurrect and encourage. This reverence, humility, this awareness of the pain of others. These are not the values of those who conquered nature, but of those who may one day, hopefully soon, learn to live with her.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this program, it was fascinating to hear various individuals' remembrances of Cyrus, his wife, Vittoria, and the times they lived in Arlington Heights. It gave me, and I hope you, another clue of who Cyrus Dallin really was and the impact he made and still makes on the cultural life in our community. I deeply appreciate all those who sent their remembrances and those I had the joy of visiting to hear their stories. Most particularly, I want to thank the volunteers who did the readings: Amy Ammondson, Pat McCabe, Peter Middleton, Geri Tremblay, Sarah Burks, Summer Maxwell, Marjorie Brown, Brian Sweeney, and Neil Dale. To the crew at ACMI, Jeff Monroe for his sound advice and suggestions. To Jeff Barn, the executive producer of this entire series, and Jared Sweet, the chief editor. Also, I'd like to thank those people behind the camera: Jasper Hamilton, Abby Summers, Lee Rice, and Reagan Finch. If you haven't visited the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum in Arlington Center or haven't been there for some time, I extend to you a very warm invitation to visit any Saturday or Sunday afternoon between 12 noon and 4 p.m. And the volunteer docents will be delighted to show you around. Until the next program from the museum, thank you so much for watching.